Disobedience is one of the true pillars of liberty. Consider the situation from the viewpoint of a tyrant. If his subjects are constantly bitching and moaning, saying nasty things about him, and saying things like they want someone else to be in charge, while they all continue to obey his commands, complying with his laws and paying his taxes, and even condemning any who don't obey his commands as nasty criminals, then the tyrant knows his power is secure and he has nothing to fear. There's a world of difference between, on the one hand, someone who complains about what the rulers are doing today while continuing to believe that there need to be rulers over him and over everyone else, and on the other hand, someone who knows that there is no such thing and can be no such thing as a legitimate ruler. Only the latter poses any real threat to those in power. Even some anarchists and voluntarists don't quite seem to grasp the difference, especially those who are still trying to use the political process to achieve freedom. What that kind of action implies, even if it's accidental, is that we mere peasants cannot be free and should not be free unless and until we can get some elected officials on the throne who will give us their legislative permission to be free. Voting and petitioning merely reinforces the idea that it is up to the ruling class whether we're allowed to be free or not. And there are two giant problems with this. Number one, those who seek positions of authority have never and will never give permission to the peasants to not be ruled. And number two, if you think you need someone else's permission to be free, you're already a slave inside your own head. Even among some who intellectually and philosophically understand the concept of self-ownership, non-aggression, and voluntarism, there can still be a strong residual psychological instinct to obey perceived authorities. And I personally admit to feeling that for a long time myself, years after becoming an anarchist, even when I already knew how insane and destructive that impulse was. Most of us, by way of the same general structure used in the Prussian education system, have undergone prolonged and intensive psychological indoctrination which was specifically designed to train us to bow down to and obey supposed authorities. If you want an eye-opening, stomach-churning example of just how well such indoctrination works, read Obedience to Authority by Dr. Stanley Milgram. And even when our rational mind knows something is true, our habits, instincts, fears, familiar patterns of thought, and trained-in Pavlovian responses can take a long time to outgrow. When we spent most of our formative years being bombarded with the message from parents, teachers, the media, agents of the state, that obedience is a virtue and disobedience is a sin, we learn that lie at a very deep psychological level, way beyond a merely intellectual understanding. As a result, it can take a long time for such a lie to be thoroughly rooted out. I'm going to leave you with an important yet depressing example. Look how many proud Americans, while rejoicing in their supposed freedom, continue to clamor for and beg the political elite to grant their holy permission for the slave class to please be robbed a little less by begging for tax cuts. What a pathetic spectacle it is to watch tens of millions of armed human beings begging a small handful of crooks in Washington to please let the rest of us keep more of what we produce. Meanwhile, if just a tenth of those people had the mental and psychological fortitude to simply disobey, the IRS would very quickly be history. And yet, of all those proud Americans who rant and rave, demanding that Congress do this or that, using demands which are backed by nothing, which are really no demands at all, the vast majority continue to firmly believe that they have a moral obligation to pay tribute to the ruling class via taxes and to obey their every ridiculous legislative decree. They are nothing more than slaves begging their masters for mercy while continuing to serve them whether they show mercy or not. Some of the terminology may have changed, but the mind control and indoctrination is the same as it ever was. I'm going to leave you with the wise words of former slave Frederick Douglass. He knew this full well when he wrote, "To make a contented slave, you must make a thoughtless one, It is necessary to darken his moral and mental vision and, as far as possible, to annihilate his power of reason. He must be able to detect no inconsistencies in slavery. The man that takes his earnings must be able to convince him that he has a perfect right to do so. It must not depend on mere force. The slave must know no higher law than his master's will. The whole relationship must not only demonstrate to his mind its necessity, but its absolute rightfulness.
And how can this be? For he is the Kwisatz Haderach.
Hey!